Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Take three. Our featured guest today is Erin Bartels. Erin Bartels is the award-winning author of We Hope for Better Things, a 2020 Michigan Notable Book, a 2020 WFWA Star Award winner, and a 2019 Christy Award finalist. Other books include The Words Between Us, a 2020 Christy Award finalist and a 2015 WFWA Rising Star Award winner, and All That We Carried, released in January 2021. Her short story, This Elegant Ruin, was a finalist in the Saturday Evening Post 2014 Great American Fiction Contest. Her poems have been published by The Lyric and the East Lansing Poetry Attack. Her first novel, We Hope for Better Things, was set partly in Detroit, and the story revolves around a family history that plays out in 3 time periods. Mary Balsam is a white abolitionist who shelters fugitive enslaved people during the Civil War and falls in love with one of them. Nora Balsam marries a Black photographer in the 1960s. Elizabeth Balsam is a Detroit reporter in contemporary times who moves into the historic family home with Nora and slowly learns of her family history. Welcome to the podcast, Erin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you've lived in several areas of Michigan. How did you get to know Detroit, and what drew you to set the novel partly in Detroit?
Well, my entire family is from Detroit, both sides. So my mother grew up in Detroit, like West Detroit, kind of close to Redford, so the west side. And my dad grew up in Birmingham and Bloomfield Hills. So you've got a kind of, blue collar, white collar divide. And what's really great about having a family history in that city is I got to spend a lot of time there visiting grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins. When I was growing up, I grew up about 2 hours north of Detroit. And so I really wanted to set a book there at some point. And I am a student of American history, and I love learning more about the places that are important to me. And so I eventually decided I wanted to set a book in a few different time periods, as you mentioned. And 1960s Detroit, there's so much going on. And in the Civil War era, there's a lot going on as well in Southern Michigan. There was a lot of abolitionist movement, and a number of really interesting people are buried here that you wouldn't think, who moved up from the South. And the movement of people because of opportunities is always really interesting. And so many people moved from the South to Detroit over the years during the Great Migration. So there's just so much history to pull from, both American history or the history of the Great Lakes region, and also my own personal family history. So it was really fun to be able to talk to my parents who grew up in that area in the 60s and get their insight into how people lived and where people went and all the sorts of challenges that people might encounter during the time that the Detroit riots happened.
In each timeline in your novel, one of the Balsam women who are white falls in love with a Black man, and it changes her life. What inspired you to write this story?
Well, what's funny is when I first thought of the idea, it had nothing to do with race. It was just the idea of finding a box of photographs where you didn't know who took the pictures, but you could see what was important to them, what they decided to show you. And it was going to be a dual timeline, and it was going to be the present day and World War II. Somewhere along the line, it changed, and I really don't remember deciding to write about this topic. It just kind of happened. And I think that one of the things that interested me, I started writing this book, well, I had the idea for it about 2011, and I researched all of 2013 and started writing in 2014. And that was pretty early on in a lot of the things that have been going on in the last decade in the US that relate to race relations. So I don't know that it was something in the news that made me think about writing that, but because there's such an interesting and rich history in the city of Detroit of, how do we live together? and how do we understand each other and how to become closer together, that it seemed like if you were going to write about Detroit in the 60s, you had to write about race. And so it kind of grew out of that. And I don't have any personal experience in my own family or in my own life of interracial relationships, but I know a lot of people in my sphere of friends and people who go to church with me and things like that, who have a lot of experience with that. So it was just something that interested me, and that relationship between a man and a woman coming together is a great way to identify and talk about issues that anybody coming together, whether you're a coworker or a friend or romantically involved, what does that look like? What are the things that make it more difficult when you involve, hundreds of years of history?
You've alluded to this somewhat in your last answer, but you did start writing the book in 2012, and obviously in the decades since, many highly publicized events involving violence against African Americans by white Americans have occurred.
Yeah.
Are there any particular memories or recollections that you have of key events that had a direct impact on your writing or on the trajectory of your writing process?
Actually, there I would say yes, although it eventually got changed in the editing process. I think that I always knew what the past tense timelines were going to be about. But it was the modern day timeline that was a little more difficult, because as I was writing and revising and looking for an agent and looking for a publisher, things kept happening in the news. And there was an element of how much of this, ripped from the headlines stuff do I really want to put into this story? So for a while, the end of the modern story was very different. And actually some of the characters were different. And it was more involved with kind of the idea of current issues with violence. And throughout the editing process, talking to editors and agents, we decided to pull back on that a little bit, not because all things are solved and everything's peachy keen, but because we wanted it to feel like it wasn't tied to our present time, exactly what was happening in the news then, because this is unfortunately, this is a timeless subject. And that was one of the frustrations of working on it for so long before it came out, was there was always something where I'm like, oh gosh, I really could talk about this and it really relates to my book, but it's really not time to talk about it for me personally until you have the actual book out there. But that there's always something else. So unfortunately, it's always something that's timely to talk about. And I think that's why people still want to talk about this particular book, a few years after it came out, even as I have other things coming out, because this one is something that I think, we're still dealing with and we will still deal with. You can't erase hundreds of years of oppression and violence with a book.
You also had a lot of early readers who helped you shape your story and the characters. What kinds of things did you learn from them, and what did you find most helpful?
Yeah, I had more people read this book than any of my subsequent books. I'm actually really paring my list down. But this one I think was important because it covered so many different types of sensitive topics and it covered different time periods. So I had people read it who were, one of my friends is the Capitol historian in Michigan, and she knows everything there is to know about houses and furniture. And so she's going to read it with an eye toward history. In very particular ways. But I really needed, because the cast is about half white and half Black, I really needed friends who were African American to read it and talk about, point out things that I was missing, things that I was misrepresenting, ways in which I might have fallen into stereotypes, even the way people spoke. Because for someone who, I grew up in a very small town that was 99% white. My parents grew up in a really, I think at that time it was pretty equally Black and white in the Detroit area. Now, Detroit is majority Black. But I didn't have a lot of experience, I had zero experience being a minority ever. So you really need help with those things that you don't understand. So I partnered up with a few different friends, writers, and one in particular was extremely helpful. Her name's Nancy Johnson, and she's a writer, and her debut novel, The Kindest Lie, came out this year. And so I strongly encourage people to check that out. She's a fantastic writer. And I got the opportunity to review that book for her ahead of time in the same capacity. So she's reading as a Black reader, I'm reading as a white reader, saying, okay, well, I think maybe you're missing this or that. So she was really helpful, especially in pointing out parts of the story where Black characters could have more agency, where things weren't just happening to them. They were making their own decisions and dealing with the ramifications of their own decisions. And she was just really, really helpful. I think some of the other people who read it were a little afraid to point things out because we're friends and they didn't want it to feel awkward, even though I kept asking them, I'm like, tell me what I'm doing wrong. Because Nancy's a friend and a writer, she's like, no, I want you to do this right. So she was really helpful.
So the journey to publication did take several years, as you mentioned. So, and you were talking about your early readers, and how was the relationship with publishers? How did that evolve? How did they react to your story?
Well, so I've worked in publishing since I was 22. So I kind of went into this knowing what to expect. A lot of people go into publishing their first book and they just really have no idea. And my writing in general tends to be in this no man's land because it's not one thing or another. So this happens to have historical fiction, and it's marketed as women's fiction because they're female protagonists. It deals with a lot of sort of, I don't know that it deals with exclusively feminine issues. I really don't think it does. If they were male protagonists or I was a male author, it would just be called fiction. But that's the way you market things. You want to make sure that you get to your audience. So I knew that it would be something that publishers who published upmarket women's fiction would be interested in. But because it's touching a lot of different genres, it might be hard to market. And it's also, I did have a possible agent before I got mine talk about, well, I really love this book, but I wouldn't want to start you out on an issues book. And I thought that was interesting. She wanted to start out with something else. And I'm like, no, this is the one I'm starting with. So I'm not interested in writing something else right now. But over the years of working on it, it took years to get an agent even, because you have to find the right person for each project. And then that agent has to find the right editor and the right publishing house. And it did go a little ways into a couple different publishing houses, general publishing houses. Ultimately, the editorial board or the pub board decided, no, I don't think that we can be successful with this. And then it eventually went to the publisher that I work for, which I was hesitant to do because there's a lot of potential awkwardness publishing with your own publisher, with the people you work with, and knowing when you can step on a certain line or not, because as an author, you are not privy to certain things, but as somebody who works in the company, you really are. So it did eventually find a home, and I think it's been a really good partnership. I've done all of my books so far with Revell Books, and I have another one coming out in January, and I'm contracted for 2 more. So all the way through 2024, I think. Yeah, I think I'll be publishing with them. I'll have at least 6 books out with them.
Wow. Can I ask what you do for the publisher? Did you have to publicize your own book, for example?
Well, in some way, I work as a copywriter. So I do marketing writing. And so I've spent a very long time, probably 16 of those years that I've worked for them have been as a copywriter, basically trying to sell other people's books. So I have a lot of experience taking a book and putting it down into about 150, 200 words that hopefully get you to buy it. So the copy that appears on the back cover in our catalogs and like on Amazon and other online retailers, that's my writing. And I've gotten very good at that. So I'm a good editor. I'm a good self-editor because you have to, fit into a certain space on a back cover. So when I was working on this book, it had started out in the like 80,000 word range, because that's usually what you do for women's fiction. And another agent that I didn't end up going with said, well, I'd like to see this scene and this scene. And I said, oh, I was kind of afraid it would get too long. And she said, well, just write what you need to write and then we'll see. And then it became, I think it was like 120,000 words, which is a little long for women's fiction. And eventually I think it got down to about 103. And during one of those passes when I was editing it, I removed about 10,000 words and I didn't remove any scenes. It was just a word here and there and slightly changing things and tightening things up, which is my favorite part of it. I really like making things tight and making sure that every word counts. So it kind of bleeds over in a little bit into my creative writing. But yeah, my 9-to-5 job is marketing, essentially.
So now that the book is out and readers have discovered it, what kinds of feedback are you hearing from the readers who are enjoying this book? What do they like most about the book?
You know, it's interesting how many people specifically point out that they want to go talk to some older people in their family and get some stories before they're gone. Because a lot of this is, as you said in your introduction, Kim, which I think was perfect, that this main character in the present day timeline, Elizabeth, is slowly learning her own family history. And, you know, the time when you're going to be coming upon a box of photos or a box of letters is gone. Nobody is creating physical evidence of their lives anymore. It's all digital. And so I think that a lot of people who read it, who have elderly relatives, they want to make sure that they don't miss out on some really great stories. And I think that's a neat, I never thought of that as a way that somebody would react to this book. I was actually kind of bracing myself for a lot of criticism, and I have thankfully not received a lot of it. I don't go on Goodreads, so that's where you'll find it if you're looking. But I have had a lot of really positive reactions from readers of very different ages, readers of different races. I think it really touches people somewhere in their lives. There's something in that book. And I think that that's why a lot of people connect with it. I had a young woman in her 20s message me that she had almost the exact same conversation with her parents about her boyfriend who's Black, as Nora did with her parents about William in the 1960s timeline. And, you know, so it's still really hard for people to navigate those relationships in families that aren't accepting of them. And that's really unfortunate. But I was really glad that she found something in that book that, you know, gave her some comfort that she's not the only one going through that, you know.
Wow. Well, you've touched on this question just a little bit, but I'm going to ask anyway. You've also written that you were aware of the challenges of writing this story as a white female author. Is it a challenge you think you'd take on again? Is that something you want to try again?
It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. But the thing about what I decide to write next, it's always something that kind of develops over a period of time. One idea attaches itself to another. And so far, I mean, I feel like I've written what I want to say about that particular subject. So I don't anticipate writing another book about that, but that doesn't mean that won't creep into other books. So my second book, The Words Between Us, has nothing to do with race. It is set in a dual timeline, a sort of now and then, but it's not historical. Most of the characters are white because it's set in a fictionalized version of my hometown. But I have a lot of experience in the past decade working with a lot of refugee communities in the Lansing area in Michigan. And I wanted to put a little bit of that in that story, because to me, those are really important relationships that I have. So there's a character there who's a recent refugee, and there's a few little things that nod to some of her challenges in that, but not a lot. I wanted her to be there as a matter of fact, because there are communities where that is just a regular thing. And it's not about refugees. It's just another character. So I think that in general, that's the kind of thing that you would see popping up in my work in the future. If talking about racial things, it would be, hey, guess what? There's lots of different people who live around here. And it doesn't have to be about that thing to speak a little bit to it. And I think that in some ways, those are effective for people who would not seek out a book that was an issues book like that agent had mentioned. So if somebody's like, well, I don't really want to hear about that. If you read a book where it's happening anyway, and it's normal because that's how the world is. I just found out yesterday, in fact, that the county that I live in Michigan, Ingham County, is the second most diverse county after Wayne County, which is where Detroit is. And that didn't surprise me because Lansing and East Lansing are extremely diverse. And, you know, growing up in a really white town, and now I have a son who's growing up in a very diverse town, I really like that. I like knowing that that is a normal, natural part of his growing up, and that he doesn't have to be, you know, educated about that in the same way that I did. He does need education about that because you don't see the history when you are interacting with someone just one-on-one. And so it's important to learn that, but it's not strange for him to see people who are nothing like him, who don't speak the same language, who have different color skin, who dress completely different, who have very different ways of being. So I really, really appreciate that. And I think that that sort of thing will pop up here and there in my writing.
Is there a specific project you're working on right now?
There's always a lot of projects I'm working on. Yeah, I just turned in the final edits on the book that's coming out in January, which is called The Girl Who Could Breathe Underwater. And that is a book I'm really excited about finally releasing because I started writing it in 2015, and it's a really personal book. The story is not based on real life, but a lot of the experiences of the character are when it comes to kind of friendships that fall apart and kind of an abusive relationship. So it's a little heavier. Well, it's not heavier than We Hope for Better Things. There was a lot of heavy stuff in that. But there's always a little bit of humor, a little bit of relationship type things in my books that kind of not counteract, but balance, I think, the issues or the heavy, you know, sort of emotional things that you might encounter reading them. So that's coming out in January. And I'm also working on, I just finished the first draft of a book that I'm really excited about that's going to come out the next year. And that is, I won't tell you the name of it because I'm sure it'll change. They always change. But it's about musicians, and it's set in a fictionalized sort of community between Ann Arbor and Detroit. And it's set in 1990, which I had a lot of fun reliving. Just, I feel like that time of life and that time, the switch from 1989 to 1990 was an extremely hopeful time, probably naively hopeful, as you like know by the end of the year 1990 when we're involved in all these things overseas in the Middle East. But I remember that being an extremely hopeful time. And I think I just wanted to spend some time where there were no cell phones and no internet, and people were still using vinyl, cassettes, and CDs all at the same time. I don't know, it was just a really interesting time. And I've had a lot of fun with that because I started playing guitar years ago when my son was very small. I wanted to learn how to play guitar, and my husband plays guitar and has for a really long time. And in writing this book, I also wrote songs, which I'd never done. I've written poetry, so there's a little bit of a connection there, but I'd never written a song. And so I'm writing songs for the book, and, you know, I'm kind of putting them on my Instagram, IGTV, and just having a lot of fun doing a different kind of writing than I've ever done. And I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just sort of making it up as I go along. I don't have a lot of music theory stuck up here because when I, you know, took piano lessons as a kid, that was the most boring part. And I'm like, I don't want to learn this, but I probably should have.
So the songs you're writing, are they grunge rock?
No, they're not. They're not grunge because you have to remember that the Midwest is always a little further behind the coasts, right? So stuff that was happening, there was definitely grunge stuff happening in the Pacific Northwest. And you actually had some of those groups perform in Detroit a lot. Detroit was a big deal when it came to music at that time and a little earlier. I mean, if you could make it in New York, LA, and Detroit, you were set. And so you have a lot of those bands showing up in 1989, 1990, 1991. A lot of them played at St. Andrew's Hall, which is a location in the book where some of this goes down. But the problem with these musicians is that he's coming out of a band where they wanted to be sort of straight down the narrow rock and roll, because that's what gets you in the magazines, and that's what gets you airtime, and that's what gets you girls following you around. And then the person he pairs up with, she has a history of lots of different types of music. She's gone to Juilliard. She's a real musician. And so it's going to be kind of coming together and melding these very different types of music, and how do we make something real that's not just for, and that's kind of the theme is, are you making your art to please other people, or are you making it for yourself? Are you making it so that you'll get more followers, be more popular, or are you making it because you actually like what you're making? And I think that as a writer, there's pressure after you start publishing to make sure that you please an audience, and they have certain expectations of you. So my first book had historical fiction stuff. It had issues in it. My second book doesn't have that. And I did that on purpose because I didn't want people to expect me to always write the same book, because that sounds super boring. So it kind of goes through a lot of the themes that, as a different type of artist, as a writer, I'm, dealing with and struggling with. And that's kind of what guides what I decide to write next. It's what is on my mind. What do I want to know more about? What do I struggle with personally? So a lot of people ask, are any of your characters based on real people? And I like to say they're all based on me. It's all about me, really, like exercising demons and working through problems.
Awesome. Well, speaking of the things that you like in your art, I'm wondering if there's something you'd like to read for our listeners.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to read chapter 2 from We Hope for Better Things. Now, it had been mentioned before that there's 3 different timelines, so you're not missing anything here. This is the first chapter of the timeline that happens in the 1960s in Detroit. And so put yourself into 1963. It's March, and we're in Detroit, and we're going to follow Nora as she meets William. Nora was finding it difficult to breathe. The man in the photo wore the same hat, the same suit and tie, the same shoes shined to reflective brilliance. She recognized the nose, the mouth, the eyes, though they were distorted. The high forehead drawn into deep furrows, lips twisted into a shout, left hand packed into a fist at his side, right hand reaching out, claw-like, and wearing a familiar ring. He was lunging at the camera, or rather, at whoever held it. That's the last photograph I took with that camera, came a silky voice behind her. Nora spun around to find she stood eye to chest with a man in a loose white button-up shirt tucked into black pants. She took a step back. The man smiling down at her was lean and striking, with skin the color of dark mahogany and deep brown eyes. A badge clipped to his breast pocket proclaimed exhibitor. You took this picture? The man nodded and held out his hand. I took all the photos on this wall. Where did you take this? Nora asked, ignoring the proffered hand. She certainly wouldn't shake it. I took that outside the GM building a few months back. That fellow was mad. Right after I took that photo, he smashed my camera on the sidewalk. You believe that? I grabbed it up quick and took off. Saved the film, but that thing ain't never going to take no pictures no more. That's for sure. What did you do to him? The man held up both hands in surrender. Hey, I didn't do nothing to that guy. Well, you must have done something. Why was he so angry? Why would he attack you? The man shook his head. Men like that don't need a reason. Like what? You know, big men. They don't need a reason for anything they do. Do whatever they want. No consequences. Nora could tell she was scowling. She relaxed her facial muscles. Scowling at 20 meant wrinkles at 30, or so her mother reminded her with some regularity. I just don't understand what would cause him to do that. He's not... She stopped short and saw something click in the man's mind. He opened his mouth, but before he could ask the question, Diane slid up, already speaking. Did you see that series with the enormous twins on little motorbikes down the South Hall? It was hideously creepy. I mean, twins are disturbing anyway, and she suddenly seemed to realize that no one was listening to her. Hey, what's the deal? She turned to look at the picture Nora was attempting to block with her petite frame. "Oh my word, is that your dad?" Her voice echoed in the stark hall. "Keep your voice down." Nora tipped her head toward the lanky photographer. "Oh," Diane said. She pulled the strap of her purse over her head. "He took the picture," Nora said under her breath. The man lifted one hand in greeting, then put both in his pockets. "Serious?" She let out a little snort, then stifled her laughter at Nora's disapproving glare. "Well, I guess you two must have something to talk about. I'll just be somewhere." She scuttled off, leaving Nora to face the awkward situation alone. "Listen, miss, I'm sorry about that. I didn't know." Nora shook her head rapidly. No need to apologize, but of course I must ask you to take it down." He frowned. "Take it down? It's the best one of the bunch. Judging doesn't happen until 3:00. There's no way I'm taking it down before then." Nora clenched her fists and manufactured a smile. "Please? Lots of people know my father. Someone will recognize him." "So?" He shrugged. "So? Yeah, so what if he's recognized? I hope he is. Why shouldn't he be?" Nora felt herself scowling again. "Because that's rude. It's incredibly rude to take a picture of someone when they're upset and then plaster it all over for the world to see." The man's eyes widened. "Rude? Ain't it rude to attack someone? To destroy someone's property? You know how much overtime I had to work to afford that camera? I need that prize money. That prize money is going to buy me a new camera." Nora opened her mouth but couldn't find anything to say. "That's what I thought," the man said. He turned to walk away. "Wait, I'll buy you a new camera." He turned back, mouth twisted, eyebrows raised. "I'll buy you a new camera," she said again, "if you give me that photo right now." A bemused little smile crept over his face. "You'll buy me a camera?" "Yes." "You gonna buy me a camera?" "Yes, if you give me that photo." The man laughed. "You ain't gonna buy me no camera." She took a step forward to show that she was in earnest. "Yes, I will. You give me the name of the camera you want, and I will go straight out right now and buy it for you. All I ask in exchange is that you take down that photo immediately and give it to me when I give you the camera." Nora felt her insides squirm as the man bit his lip and looked her up and down, considering. "All right, little lady, you got yourself a deal, but you got till just 2:30 to get me a new camera. If you don't show, that photo's going back up before the judges come around." "Fine." She dug in her purse for a pen and a piece of paper. "Write down what you want, exactly what you want. If you're not specific, you'll have to take what you get." He smirked as he scribbled out Nikon F and then held the paper out to her. She took the slip and looked pointedly at the photo. All right, he said, "it's coming down." He lifted the framed print off the wall and looked from it to Nora and back again. "I can see the resemblance now." She pressed her lips together for a moment and breathed slowly through her nose. "Very funny. Where will you put it?" "I got a box, don't worry." She stuck the slip of paper into her jacket pocket and looked at the delicate silver watch on her wrist. "I'll try to be back in 30 minutes or so." He gave her a mock salute. "Hey, you know that's an expensive camera, right? It's what professionals use. You sure you can afford it?" It was Nora's turn to smirk. "I wouldn't worry about that."
Thank you very much, Erin Bartels. We appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. It's been great.
All right, and we look forward to your next books coming out soon.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.